Alright, here is the content rewritten for your YouTube channel, Saddle Sixgun, adhering to all specified requirements. Howdy, partners, and welcome to Saddle Sixgun. For all you seasoned veterans of life out there, especially those over 40 who appreciate a good Western yarn, you've come to the right place. We're about to spin a tale of grit, redemption, and the enduring power of doing what's right, even when it ain't easy. Ever wonder what it was like back then? When a hanging was like a town social event? Well, saddle up, because you're about to be right back in the Old West. So, before we begin this true-to-life old-fashioned Western story, let's get things started right. Hit that like button if you're already hooked, and don't forget to subscribe to Saddle Sixgun so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures. We bring these tales to you out of love, so a like and a subscribe really shows the love back to us. Now, settle in as we transport ourselves to a dusty town where justice hangs in the balance, and a woman's fate rests on the slimmest of threads. The rope had been tested 3 times that morning, each pull a grim rehearsal for the drama about to unfold. Yet, nobody could quite fathom why Norah Talbet, the woman soon to face that rope, kept her gaze fixed on the empty road instead of the towering gallows before her. What would you do? In the moments before your execution, would you simply accept it? She stood, a statue of quiet defiance, in her stark cell, her weathered hands gripping the cold iron bars that had once held murderers and thieves aplenty. But Norah's attention wasn't on the morbid spectacle of the crowd gathering outside, their faces a mix of morbid curiosity and righteous anger. She wasn't watching the hangman, that grim artist of death, adjust his knot with practiced ease. Her eyes were riveted, almost hypnotized, by something no one else in that town seemed to notice, much less see. A faint dust cloud on the distant horizon, a mere smudge against the vast expanse of the sky. That dust cloud might mean nothing, a simple desert breeze stirring up sand. Or it might mean everything. It might represent hope, salvation, a last-minute reprieve from the clutches of death. What could a dust cloud mean? The townspeople whispered amongst themselves, their voices a low, menacing hum that seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Some muttered that she'd stolen enough money to buy half the territory, a fortune pilfered from the trusting citizens of this hardscrabble town. Others claimed she'd been meticulously planning her crime for years, patiently waiting for the opportune moment to betray the faith of everyone who'd ever known and trusted her. Was it true? But beneath the accusations and the judgments, there was something else. Something they all agreed on, a shared secret that made their voices drop to hushed tones when they thought she couldn't hear. 20 years ago, Norah Talbet had done something that no decent woman would do, an act of defiance that had ripped the town apart, turning neighbors into bitter enemies. Now, as she stood on the precipice of death, that same act might just be the only thing that could save her. Isn't that funny how life seems to come full circle? If you like true Western stories, let us know by subscribing to Saddle Sixgun now. The sheriff, a man burdened by the weight of his duty, checked his pocket watch. 10 minutes until noon. 10 minutes until justice, in its cold and unforgiving form, would finally be served. Unless, of course, that dust cloud on the horizon contained the one person who knew the unvarnished truth about what really happened in Orville Bank's store that fateful night. But here's what nobody in that assembled crowd understood, not yet anyway. The woman they were about to hang, the woman they so readily condemned, had once saved 3 lives when nobody else would lift a finger. And sometimes, just sometimes, when you plant seeds of kindness and compassion in the darkest soil, they grow into something strong enough to reach back through time and save you when you need it most. The dust cloud was getting closer, growing larger, more defined. It belonged to a single rider, a lone figure pushing his horse harder than any animal should be pushed in this relentless heat. The poor thing probably had rocks for brains. Norah could see that much now, though she couldn't yet make out the face hidden beneath the wide-brimmed hat. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic drummer, as she pressed closer to the bars, straining to see if 20 years of hope had finally taken shape, or if it was going to amount to nothing. Sheriff Wade Langston stood just outside her cell, the keys jangling nervously in his calloused fingers. He'd known Norah since she was just a girl, a slip of a thing with dirt under her fingernails and dreams bigger than this small town could ever contain. Now, he had to walk her to the gallows in just 8 minutes, and the weight of that grim task was crushing him from the inside out. What could he say to her? What comfort could he offer? What could he do, knowing she was very well innocent? "You keep looking at that road like you're expecting someone," Wade said, his voice barely above a whisper, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the jail. "But nobody's coming, Norah. Everybody who might have spoken for you already tried, and they failed." She turned away from the window, her gaze locking with his, and Wade saw something in her eyes that made his stomach drop like a stone. It wasn't fear, the natural dread of impending death. It wasn't resignation, the quiet acceptance of a fate she couldn't escape. It was something else entirely, a fierce kind of certainty, an unwavering belief that didn't belong on the face of a woman about to die. "3 people know I didn't steal that money, Wade," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. "You, me, and Orville Banks himself." She paused, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Banks swore under oath that he saw me. Banks is a liar." She took a breath. "And somewhere out there are 2 witnesses who can prove it. The question is whether they'll make it in time. Do you like Norah? Do you think she should be saved?" Wade's mind raced back to the trial 3 weeks ago, a blur of accusations and damning evidence. Orville Banks had stood before Judge Morrison with tears in his eyes, his voice trembling with feigned grief, swearing he'd caught Norah red-handed, clutching his strong box filled with the savings he'd carefully accumulated for his daughter's wedding. The evidence seemed overwhelming, a mountain of circumstantial details that pointed squarely at Norah's guilt. Her shawl, found discarded near the broken window of Banks' store. Mud on her boots that matched the dirt on the store floor. And, most damning of all, $50 in cash, suspiciously found hidden inside her modest cabin. It seemed like the perfect crime had been committed. What had she done? But Wade remembered something else from that trial, something that had nagged at him ever since. When Orville testified, his hands shook, not with grief or anger, but with something that looked suspiciously like fear. And twice during his testimony, he'd glanced nervously toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in and contradict every word he spoke. What was he so afraid of? What was he hiding? "The money they found in your cabin," Wade said slowly, carefully, his eyes searching her face for any flicker of deception. "You never did explain where it came from." Norah's laugh was bitter, a harsh sound that echoed in the confines of the cell. "Would you have believed me? A poor widow claiming someone gave her $50 out of pure kindness in this town? That's a harder story to swallow than theft, isn't it?" The rider was closer now, so close that Norah could make out the determined set of his shoulders, the way he leaned forward in the saddle like a man racing against death itself. Her breath caught in her throat. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the seed she'd planted in darkness 20 years ago had grown into something strong enough to save her. But there were still 7 minutes left, and 7 minutes could feel like an eternity when a hangman's noose was waiting. 20 years earlier, the snow had been falling hard, blanketing the town in a thick, white shroud when Norah first saw the 3 Apache children huddled behind her woodshed. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old, their clothes torn and tattered, their eyes hollow with hunger and loss. They looked as if they'd been abandoned. Most folks in town would have driven them off with a shotgun, chased them away like stray dogs. Some might have grudgingly called the authorities, who would have hauled them off to the nearest reservation, 200 miles away. But Norah was different. Norah saw something in those children that nobody else did. Hope, she thought. Norah had brought them inside, into the warmth of her humble home, and fed them a steaming bowl of hearty soup. That single, simple act of defiance had cost her everything. Her few friends stopped speaking to her, crossing the street to avoid her gaze. The preacher banned her from Sunday services, condemning her for consorting with heathens. Customers refused to buy the vegetables from her garden or the quilts she sewed to make ends meet. Within a month, she'd gone from struggling widow to complete outcast, ostracized by the very community she'd called home. All because she'd seen 3 starving children and couldn't turn away. But she'd kept those children alive, nurturing them, feeding them, clothing them, teaching them to read and write in both English and their native Apache tongue. Sterling, Ivy, and Malachi, each unique and precious in their own way, had come to call her mother in Apache, a word that sounded like music when it came from their lips. It was then that she knew she was doing the right thing, despite what the others said. For 12 years, they'd been her family, and she'd been theirs, a bond forged in love and resilience. Then, as all children do, they'd grown up and left to make their own way in the world, carrying with them the lessons she'd taught them and the love she'd freely given. Sterling had always been the smartest, devouring law books by candlelight and talking about justice like it was something that could actually exist, something worth fighting for. Ivy had inherited her grandmother's ancient skill with healing herbs and her grandfather's sharp head for business, a potent combination that made her a force to be reckoned with. Malachi, the quietest of the 3, could track a rabbit across bare rock and shoot a tin can off a fence post from 50 yards, skills honed by a life spent close to the land. Now, as the rider drew closer, Norah could see the familiar way he sat his horse, the confident bearing that she'd watched develop from a frightened 8-year-old into a man who believed he could change the world. It was Sterling, and he was pushing that poor animal beyond its limits, racing against time itself, as if his own life depended on reaching the gallows before the rope did its deadly work. Wade checked his pocket watch again. 5 minutes. The crowd outside was growing increasingly restless, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and impatience, calling for justice in voices that carried through the stone walls of the jail. Some of them had been calling for her blood since the day she'd taken in those Apache children. This trial was just an excuse to finish what they'd started 20 years ago, to finally rid themselves of the woman who dared to defy their prejudices. "He won't make it in time," Wade said, his voice laced with resignation, following her gaze to the approaching rider. "Even if that's who you think it is, even if he's got something to say, 5 minutes isn't enough to stop this. What do you think? Will he make it in time?" But Norah wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering Sterling at 15, standing in her small kitchen with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, promising that someday he'd be important enough to protect her the way she'd protected him. She'd laughed then, not because she didn't believe him, but because she'd never thought she needed protecting. She was about to find out if he'd kept that promise. Has he kept that promise? Sterling's voice reached them before his horse did, cutting through the crowd's murmur like thunder across still water. "Stop. Stop the execution." His words carried the undeniable authority of a man who'd spent years learning how to command attention in courtrooms, where his skin color made him unwelcome, a man who knew how to fight for what was right. The crowd turned as one, their faces twisting with a mixture of confusion and anger. Some recognized him immediately, the Apache boy who'd grown up in Norah's cabin, who'd left town with books under his arm and fire in his eyes. Others saw only what they'd always seen, an outsider trying to interfere with white man's justice. How dare he? Wade stepped outside the jailhouse, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. Not because he expected trouble from Sterling, but because the crowd was already stirring like a nest of angry hornets, ready to swarm and sting at the slightest provocation. "Sterling Maddox," he called out, his voice clear and firm. "You've got 4 minutes to say whatever you came to say." Sterling dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his legs steady despite the punishing ride. In his hand was a worn leather satchel, the kind lawyers carried when they had business that could change everything. "Sheriff Langston, I have evidence that proves Norah Talbet's innocence. Evidence that should have been presented at trial." Judge Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face red with indignation. "Young man, this woman was tried and convicted by a jury of her peers. The time for appeals has passed." Sterling's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath, a quiet determination that couldn't be denied. "Not entirely, Your Honor. Because, according to territorial law, new evidence discovered after sentencing can halt an execution if presented to the presiding judge. And I have new evidence, Your Honor. He paused for effect, his eyes scanning the crowd. Evidence that proves Orville Banks committed perjury when he testified against Mrs. Talbot. The crowd's murmur became a roar, a cacophony of disbelief and outrage. Orville Banks, who'd been standing near the gallows with his hat in his hands and sorrow painted on his face, suddenly looked like a man who'd seen his own ghost. His eyes darted left and right, searching desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. So he finally got caught, huh? That's a serious accusation, Judge Morrison said, his voice having lost some of its earlier certainty. What kind of evidence? Sterling reached into his satchel and pulled out a stack of papers. Bank records from Denver, Your Honor. Records showing that Orville Banks withdrew exactly $50 from his account 3 days before the supposed theft. The same $50 that was mysteriously found in Mrs. Talbot's cabin. That's pretty damning. What do you think, is Norah going to be saved? Wade felt his stomach drop. He remembered how quickly they'd found that money, how conveniently it had been hidden where any search would uncover it. At the time, it had seemed like divine justice, a clear sign of her guilt. Now it looked like something else entirely, something far more sinister. What else could there be to the case? More importantly, Sterling continued, his voice rising so the entire crowd could hear, I have a witness who saw Banks plant that money himself. Someone who was afraid to come forward during the trial, but who's ready to tell the truth now. Orville Banks broke. His carefully composed mask of grief cracked like an egg, revealing the raw panic beneath. He turned and started pushing through the crowd, but there was nowhere to run in a town this small, nowhere to hide from the truth that was finally catching up with him. Is it too late for him? But Sterling wasn't finished. He had one more card to play, one more revelation that would either save Norah's life or damn them all. The witness, Sterling announced, his voice ringing with authority, is Miss Ivy Boone. The crowd gasped, but had seen it all along. The witness stepped out from behind the general store where she'd been waiting, a figure of quiet strength and unwavering resolve. And every person in that crowd who'd lived in town 20 years ago felt their breath catch in their throat. Ivy Boone had grown into a woman of quiet dignity, her long black hair braided with silver threads that caught the sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with the poise of someone who'd learned to navigate a world that didn't want her to succeed. What was she going to say? I saw Orville Banks break into Norah's cabin, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. 3 nights before he claimed she robbed his store, I saw him plant that money under her floorboards, and I saw him take her shawl from the clothesline to leave at his shop. What a testimony! Judge Morrison's face had gone pale. Miss, do you realize the gravity of what you're claiming? Why didn't you come forward during the trial? Ivy's smile was bitter. Would you have believed the word of an Apache woman against a respected white businessman? Would any jury in this territory have taken my testimony seriously? She gestured toward the crowd, many of whom were looking at their shoes rather than meeting her eyes. These people watched Norah starve rather than trade with her because she showed kindness to Indian children. You think they would have cared about Indian testimony? It was true, they wouldn't have cared at all. Wade stepped forward, his mind racing. Ivy, if you saw him plant the money, why didn't you warn Norah? Why didn't you tell her what was coming? I tried, Ivy's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion she'd allowed herself to show. I rode to her cabin the next morning, but she was already gone to market. By the time I found her, Banks had already raised the alarm about his missing money. She took a shaky breath. Then she was arrested so quickly, I couldn't get word to her without putting myself in danger. Sterling placed a protective hand on his sister's shoulder. They'd always been close, the 3 children Norah had raised, but Ivy had inherited their Apache grandmother's gift for moving unseen and unheard. If anyone could have witnessed Banks's deception without being caught, it would have been her. There's more, Sterling said, pulling another document from his satchel. Ivy didn't just see the setup. She followed Banks afterward. She watched him bury the real money from his strong box in the cemetery behind his wife's headstone. "We dug it up yesterday." The crowd erupted, voices rising in confusion and anger, some demanding Banks's immediate arrest, others shouting that this was all Apache lies designed to save a guilty woman. In the chaos, nobody noticed Orville Banks pulling a small derringer from his coat pocket. Nobody except Norah, who was watching from her cell window with growing horror. What's he going to do with that? Banks raised the gun toward Sterling and Ivy, his hand trembling, but his intent clear. 20 years of guilt and fear had finally driven him to the edge, and if he was going down, he was determined to take the only witnesses with him. Norah screamed a warning that was lost in the crowd's noise. But her voice reached the one person who could do something about it. The shot rang out before Banks could pull his trigger, and the derringer flew from his hand to land in the dust 20 feet away. Banks screamed and clutched his wrist, blood seeping between his fingers from where the bullet had grazed him with surgical precision. From the roof of the general store, Malachi Brooks lowered his rifle and gave Norah a small nod through the jailhouse window. He'd positioned himself there before dawn, watching over his family the way he'd learned to watch over everything that mattered. Some skills you never forgot, and some loyalties ran deeper than blood. The crowd scattered like startled chickens, some diving for cover behind water troughs and hitching posts, others pressing forward to get a better look at the unfolding drama. Wade drew his gun, but kept it pointed at the ground, torn between maintaining order and letting justice finally have its day. What would you have done in that situation? Sterling helped Banks to his feet, showing more mercy than the man deserved. "Dr. Henley," he called to the town physician. "Please see to his wound. We don't want Mr. Banks bleeding to death before he can confess to his crimes." "I ain't confessing to nothing," Banks snarled, cradling his injured wrist. "You got no proof of anything except the word of savages and bank papers that could have been forged." He had no way out. Judge Morrison stepped closer, his earlier uncertainty replaced by grim determination. "Mr. Maddox, you mentioned buried money. Do you have this alleged evidence with you?" Sterling reached into his satchel once more and withdrew a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of silver coins. $437, Your Honor. The exact amount Banks reported stolen from his strong box. We found it buried exactly where Ivy said it would be. Along with this, he pulled out a piece of paper yellowed with age and dirt, Banks' own handwritten inventory from the night before the supposed robbery. It lists every coin and bill in his possession down to the penny. Funny thing is, Sterling added, the inventory shows he had much more money than he ever reported to the sheriff. So that must have been the deal. Wade felt pieces clicking together in his mind like the chambers of a well-oiled revolver. He was skimming from his own business, hiding money from his partners, maybe from his wife. When someone started asking questions, he needed a scapegoat. So it finally makes sense. And who better than the town outcast? Ivy added quietly, the woman everybody already hated. Who would defend her? Who would question too closely whether she was guilty or innocent? Banks' face crumpled. 20 years of guilt and fear finally breaking him apart from the inside. She deserved it, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. Taking in those children, making decent folk look bad by comparison, acting like she was better than the rest of us with her Christian charity in her. So it's all about the hate now. He looked up at Sterling, Ivy, and the rifle-wielding figure on the rooftop. And now they come back to ruin me. My own daughter's wedding money gone to pay for lawyers and lies. The only lies told here were yours, Mr. Banks, Judge Morrison said firmly. Sheriff Langston, please place this man under arrest for perjury, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. But there was still one more revelation waiting, one final truth that would explain why Orville Banks had hated Norah Talbet enough to destroy her. Sterling's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Tell them about your son, Mr. Banks. Tell them about Thomas." Banks' face went as white as fresh snow. Around the crowd, older residents began to murmur as long-forgotten memories stirred from 25 years past. Thomas Banks had been Orville's pride and joy, a boy with his father's ambition, but none of his meanness. He'd been 18 when he died in a fever outbreak that swept through town like wildfire. How sad. Thomas wanted to marry one of those Apache girls, Banks said, his voice hollow with old pain. Not the ones she took in later, but their older sister. Met her at a trading post and lost his fool head over her dark eyes and gentle ways. I forbid it, of course. The nerve of that man. Told him he'd shame our family name, ruin his prospects. Wade remembered now, pieces of old gossip falling into place. The girl died in that same fever outbreak. Thomas nursed her, Banks continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, caught the fever himself, and died 3 days after she did. His last words were about how I'd been wrong, how love didn't see color or tribe, how he wished he'd been brave enough to marry her despite what I thought. What a story, I just can't believe it. Sterling's expression softened slightly. And when Norah took in those 3 children, it reminded you of what Thomas had tried to tell you, what you'd been too stubborn and hateful to understand. Banks sobbed. Every time I saw her with them, teaching them, loving them like they were her own blood, I saw my Thomas. I saw the man he could have been if I hadn't filled his head with poison about staying with his own kind. She did what I was too proud to let my son do, and it ate at me like acid for 20 years. What a man, what a story. Judge Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, buying time to process everything he'd just heard. The crowd had fallen silent, confronted with a truth that cut deeper than accusations of theft. This wasn't just about stolen money. This was about the cost of hatred, the price of prejudice, the way one man's bigotry had poisoned 2 decades of life in their small community. "Sheriff Langston," the judge said finally, his voice heavy with regret, "please release Mrs. Talbot immediately. All charges are dismissed." He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And let this be a lesson to all of us. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice founded on lies and hatred is no justice at all." Wade's keys jingled as he unlocked Norah's cell door. She stepped out into the sunlight for the first time in 3 weeks, blinking like a woman seeing the world with new eyes. Sterling, Ivy, and Malachi, her children in every way that mattered, surrounded her with embraces that 20 years couldn't diminish. But even as the crowd began to disperse, and Banks was led away in shackles, Norah knew that her real trial was just beginning. Rebuilding a life in a town that had been ready to watch her die wouldn't be easy. But she had something now that she'd never had before, the unwavering support of 3 loyal children and the faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Maybe the town could finally let go of its prejudices and learn to accept her for who she was. How did she get so lucky? 6 months after the truth came out, Norah's vegetable garden was flourishing again, its rows bursting with vibrant colors and the sweet smell of growing things. The same people who'd refused to buy from her for 20 years now waited in line at her gate, eager to purchase the finest tomatoes and corn in 3 counties. Some came out of guilt, a belated attempt to make amends for their past cruelty. Others came out of genuine respect, finally seeing Norah for the kind and compassionate woman she was. But most came because word had spread that Norah Talbet grew vegetables with a magic that had nothing to do with supernatural forces and everything to do with patient care and hard work. How nice. Sterling had returned to his law practice in Denver, but not before establishing a small legal aid office in town, a place where those who couldn't afford big city lawyers could find justice. He visited twice a month, taking cases that others wouldn't touch, fighting for the underdog and making a real difference in the lives of the less fortunate. His reputation had grown beyond the territory boundaries, and there were whispers that he might run for territorial judge when the current position opened, a prospect that filled many with hope. Ivy had settled permanently on the edge of town, combining her knowledge of traditional Apache healing methods with the modern medicine she'd studied in the East. She built a small clinic, a haven for those who couldn't afford a doctor or who preferred the natural remedies she offered. Dr. Henley, who'd initially been skeptical of her unconventional treatments, now sent patients to her regularly, recognizing the power of her healing touch. Her garden of medicinal herbs had become as famous as Norah's vegetables, a testament to the power of nature and the wisdom of ancient traditions. Malachi split his time between visiting his siblings and working as a tracker for the Territorial Marshal Service. His skills had proven invaluable in bringing criminals to justice across the frontier, and lawmen throughout the region knew they could count on his ability to find anyone who needed finding. He was a silent guardian, a protector of the innocent, and a force to be reckoned with. That's some life she's living now. The three of them took turns visiting Norah, ensuring she was never alone for long. But she wasn't the same isolated woman she'd been before the trial. The revelation of Banks's deception had opened many eyes in town, and people who'd shunned her for decades were slowly learning to see her as she really was, a woman who'd chosen love over convenience, compassion over conformity. Orville Banks himself had received a 5-year sentence for perjury and fraud, a punishment that seemed light compared to the damage he'd inflicted. His wife had divorced him, unable to forgive his betrayal. His business partners had dissolved their agreements, leaving him penniless and alone. And his daughter had postponed her wedding indefinitely, unable to reconcile her love for her father with the knowledge of his cruelty. He spent his days in the territorial prison, writing letters that no one answered, and thinking about a son who died believing in love, while his father had lived believing in hate. What a waste of a life. Judge Morrison had issued a formal apology to Norah, a public acknowledgement of the injustice she'd suffered, which was published in the territorial newspaper and read aloud in 3 neighboring towns. He'd also implemented new procedures for reviewing evidence in capital cases, ensuring that no other innocent person would come so close to execution based on incomplete or biased testimony. But perhaps the most significant change was in the town itself. The children who'd grown up watching their parents shun Norah were now adults with children of their own, and many had quietly promised themselves that they would teach their sons and daughters different lessons, lessons about kindness and acceptance, lessons about judging people by their actions, not by their race or their past. Wade Langston had been re-elected sheriff by the widest margin in the town's history. Partly because of his role in helping uncover the truth, but mostly because people had seen him struggle with the weight of nearly executing an innocent woman and respected the way he'd handled that burden. He was a man of integrity, a man who'd learned from his mistakes, and a man who was committed to serving his community with fairness and justice. As autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Norah found herself preparing for the first winter in 20 years when she wouldn't have to worry about having enough food or fuel to survive. She had a full pantry, a warm home, and the love of her children to keep her company. 1 year to the day after her scheduled execution, Norah stood in the same spot where the gallows had been erected, a place that had once been a symbol of fear and oppression. The town had torn down that grim structure within a week of her exoneration, erasing the stain of injustice from their community. In its place, they'd planted a small garden with a wooden bench where anyone could sit and rest in the shade of a growing oak tree. What an honor for her! Sterling, Ivy, and Malachi had all returned for this anniversary, not to mark the day she'd almost died, but to celebrate the day that truth had finally prevailed over prejudice, a day that would forever be etched in their hearts. They sat together on the bench, 4 people bound not by blood, but by something stronger, the unbreakable connection between a woman who'd chosen to love unconditionally and the children who'd grown up to honor that love. "I got a letter yesterday," Sterling said, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "From the territorial governor. He's appointing me to the judicial commission that reviews pardons and commutations. Says the territory needs judges who understand that justice isn't just about following the law, but about following conscience, too." So much happiness. Ivy smiled and patted his shoulder. Thomas Banks would be proud. His father spent 20 years hating what love could accomplish, but you've spent 20 years proving it. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Thomas Banks had died loving an Apache woman, while his father had nearly murdered the white woman who'd raised Apache children. But love had won in the end, not through grand gestures or dramatic reversals, but through the quiet persistence of people who refuse to let hatred have the final word. Malachi pointed to a young woman walking past with two small children clinging to her skirts. "That's Sarah Morrison, the judge's daughter. Yesterday, she asked me to teach her children how to track and hunt. Said she wants them to learn skills that matter more than the color of the person teaching them." Norah watched the children play near the oak tree, their laughter replacing the echoes of the angry crowd that had once gathered here to watch her die. These children would grow up in a town where Apache children had saved a white woman's life, where justice had been served not by a rope, but by the courage to tell the truth. Dr. Henley approached the group, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other. "Mrs. Talbet, I wanted you to know that we've had inquiries from 3 other towns about sending their doctors to train with Ivy. Her methods are becoming famous throughout the territory." "Good," Norah replied simply. "Knowledge should be shared, not hoarded." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the peaceful town square, Norah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. 20 years ago, she'd seen 3 hungry children and made a choice that cost her everything she thought she valued. Today, she realized that choice had given her everything that actually mattered. The seeds of kindness she'd planted in darkness had indeed grown into something strong enough to save her. But more than that, they'd grown into something that would continue saving others long after she was gone. In a town that had once been willing to hang her for showing mercy, her children now served justice, healing, and protection to anyone who needed them. That was a legacy worth living for. We love this story. And there you have it, friends. Another hard luck story for the ages. So if you are a fan of such adventures, give us a like and be sure to subscribe. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and justice collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe to Saddle and Sixgun and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.